He was a billionaire who could buy anything except peace. She was a widow who had lost everything except herself. What happens when the most powerful man in the room hears the word no for the first time, not from a rival, but from a secretary? Ethan Brooks ran a hospital empire with ruthless precision. He had wealth, titles, buildings named after him, but at night, he came home to silence so thick it echoed. Then came Maggie Pierce, calm, clear-eyed, and utterly unimpressed by power. She didn't ask for respect. She simply lived in a way that made you offer it. When she walked away, he realized what he was really missing. Imagine this. You've built your entire life on control. Then one day, someone comes along not to take it from you, but to remind you how much lighter life feels without it. What would you do? This isn't just a love story. It's a story about listening, about healing, about finding someone who sees you, even when the rest of the world only sees your title. If this story touches something in you, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's begin. Ethan Brooks had built an empire of healing, but no one ever told him he needed healing too. Until one woman said one word he had never heard: no. That word hadn't come yet, not officially, but it was on its way. Somewhere beyond the polished marble floors of Central Haven Hospital's executive wing, it was being spoken, slowly making its way toward the man who had lived his entire adult life on the assumption that no one would ever say it to him. Ethan sat behind his glass-top desk, overlooking the sun-drenched coastline of Santa Barbara. From this height, the world looked manageable, predictable, obedient, just the way he preferred it. He wore his usual charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, no tie. His watch, a gift from a grateful patient 15 years ago, ticked soundlessly on his wrist. There was nothing out of place, not on the desk, not in the room, not in the life he had so carefully constructed since his divorce 8 years ago. Every morning began the same: up at 5, treadmill at 5:30, protein shake at 6, email check by 6:30. The car arrived at 7, office by 7:30. From there, he ruled. It was a quiet kind of power, clinical, precise, sterile, like an operating room, like Ethan himself. He hadn't always been this way. Once, long ago, he'd believed in softer things like family dinners, spontaneous road trips, holding hands for no reason at all. But medicine had taught him discipline, business had taught him control, and heartbreak had taught him the most important lesson of all: never need anyone more than they need you. "Dr. Brooks," came the voice from the speaker on his desk. It was Marla from HR. "Do you have a moment?" Ethan pressed the intercom button. "Yes." There was a pause too long to be procedural. Then Marla's voice returned, softer this time. "It's about Carolyn. She's asked to step down." Immediately, Ethan blinked once. On what grounds she cited ongoing stress and burnout. She's been seeing the staff psychologist for several months. Apparently, none of us were aware. A silence settled over the room like a fog. Carolyn had been with him for nearly 6 years. She never raised her voice, never made excuses, always knew when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. She'd built her life around his schedule, sacrificed holidays, worked through pneumonia one year without telling him. And now, just like that, she was gone. "Do we have a replacement?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice neutral. "We've scheduled an interview this morning. She comes highly recommended. Her name is Margaret Pierce, former executive secretary to the dean of Pacific State University, widowed, 1 adult son, impeccable record. Send her in." The intercom clicked off. Ethan stood and walked to the window, watching the waves crest along the edge of the beach like fragile lace. His mind wandered not to Carolyn, not really. She had chosen to step away, and he had long ago accepted that nothing in his life stayed unless it served its function perfectly. It wasn't personal. He never let it be. Still, the word burnout scratched at something in the back of his mind. He dismissed it. The knock came exactly 4 minutes later. Prompt, but not over-eager. "Come in," Ethan said, his voice steady. The door opened, and in stepped a woman, unlike any he had worked with before. She wasn't young, thank God. He had little patience for youthful ambition, packaged in tight suits and nervous smiles. But she wasn't old either. She moved with quiet confidence, the kind that didn't demand attention, but drew it nonetheless. Margaret Pierce Maggie, as he would later come to call her, had soft gray eyes that seemed to take in the whole room in a single glance. Her dress was simple, tasteful. No jewelry, except for a thin silver band on her right hand. Not a wedding ring, something older, more personal. She didn't smile as she approached the desk, but she didn't look intimidated either. She looked present, completely, disarmingly present. "Dr. Brooks," she said with a nod. Her voice was warm, unhurried. Ethan gestured toward the seat across from him. "Ms. Pierce, please." She sat with ease, not slouched, not stiff, just balanced, like she belonged here. He scanned her resume. Impressive, just as Marla had said. But it was her demeanor that unsettled him. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it felt real, unfiltered, unaffected. Most people who came into this office were one of three things: afraid, ambitious, or in awe. She was none of them. "I expect long hours," he began, not looking up. 12-hour days are standard. Occasional weekends, availability by phone after hours. Travel is rare, but possible. "I don't work evenings or weekends," Maggie said gently. Ethan looked up. She didn't flinch, didn't fidget, just held his gaze, calm as morning light. "I've raised a son, lost a husband, built a career, and learned that no job, no matter how well paid or prestigious, is worth losing myself over again." Ethan leaned back slightly. He couldn't remember the last time someone had said no to him, at least, not without immediately apologizing for it. There was no apology in her tone, just clarity. "I'm efficient, focused, respectful, but when I leave the office at 5, I become a different version of myself, one who gardens, reads poetry, hosts Sunday dinners. That woman keeps this woman sane." Ethan said nothing, not out of offense, but out of fascination. There was no negotiation in her words, but there was also no arrogance, just truth, stated plainly, like a boundary drawn in soft chalk, firm, but not harsh. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, he believed her. "Very well," he said, closing the file. "You're hired." Maggie nodded once. "Thank you." As she rose, Ethan stood too, a gesture he rarely bothered with. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "I don't expect special treatment, Dr. Brooks, just mutual respect." The door closed quietly behind her. Ethan remained standing, staring at the space she had just occupied. He didn't realize he was smiling, not fully, but something in his face had softened something that hadn't moved in years. And behind that smile, a question echoed. "What just happened?" "You'll be expected to work evenings and weekends," he said coldly. "Then I'm not the right candidate," she replied, calmly. The words still echoed faintly in Ethan's mind, like a ripple across a surface too still for too long. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. No pause, no apology, no edge of defense. Just a clean, simple truth delivered with the grace of someone who had earned the right to know her own worth. Margaret Pierce. Maggie was unlike any hire he had made in the past 20 years. In his world, boundaries were seen as inconveniences. Time was currency. And the more you gave, the more you were valued, or so the machine of high-level healthcare leadership insisted. But here she was, a woman who could look him in the eye and say, without blinking, that she would not sacrifice her peace to meet his expectations. Not even for a prestigious title, not even for a handsome salary, not even for a man like him. Ethan had expected hesitation, negotiation, even subtle desperation, but Maggie offered none. What surprised him most, though, was that he didn't feel slighted. He felt curious. After she left the room that morning, he stood for a long while, eyes fixed on the door she had just exited. The sunlight filtering through the tall windows caught on the dustless edge of his desk. Outside, waves rose and folded along the shoreline in perfect rhythm. He realized uncomfortably that he had no idea what Maggie thought of him. Not as a boss, not as a man. She hadn't flattered, she hadn't probed, she hadn't even smiled beyond what the moment required. And still, something in her presence had shifted the air. Slightly? Yes, but distinctly. Later that day, as he reviewed the day's reports, Ethan found himself rereading Maggie's resume. Not because he doubted her qualifications, but because he wanted to understand what kind of life shaped a woman who could be so composed in a room designed to intimidate. Born in Iowa, educated at Northwestern, 20 years as an executive assistant in academia, widowed at 39, one son, currently living in Oregon. There were no gaps in her history, no red flags, but in the spaces between the lines, there was something deeper. A quiet survival, a maturity that didn't come from training, but from life lived fully and painfully. He tapped his pen against the desk. Ethan had seen grief in many forms. As a physician, as a leader, he'd seen it muffle voices, collapse posture, hollow out eyes. But Maggie had carried hers in a way that became strength, not silence. She wasn't performing resilience, she embodied it. He sat back in his chair, folding his hands loosely in his lap. A memory surfaced faint, but persistent of a conversation with Carolyn, his former secretary, months ago. She lives her life on her own terms. Carolyn had once said of someone Ethan never bothered to meet. He hadn't understood it then. He might be starting to now. By early afternoon, the final decision was expected. Marla from HR knocked gently before entering. So, thoughts, she asked. She's the only one I've interviewed, Ethan said, not looking up. Marla hesitated. Yes, but she's the one I'm hiring. Marla blinked. Even with her boundaries. He raised his eyes slowly, especially because of them. Marla tilted her head, curiosity visible but wisely unspoken. Understood. I'll get the paperwork ready. After she left, Ethan stood and walked to the small sitting area near the window. The armchairs there were rarely used, mostly decorative, a nod to hospitality. He sat down anyway, letting the sunlight wash across his shoulders. It had been a long time since anyone reminded him, without ever meaning to, that power wasn't about control. Sometimes it was about restraint. He'd spent so many years building schedules, monitoring metrics, driving outcomes. But what about the human beings behind all those numbers? What about the people who refused to be numbers? What about Maggie? She returned to his office the next morning to sign her contract. They didn't speak much. She read every word, asked 2 precise questions, signed with a fountain pen she brought herself. As she stood to leave, Ethan said, "We begin Monday." She nodded. "Monday it is." She reached the door, then turned, her hand on the handle. "Dr. Brooks," she said softly, "just so we're clear, I'm committed, not compliant. I take my work seriously. I expect to be treated the same way." Ethan felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth, the smallest crack in his stone expression. "Understood," he said, and he did understand more than he was willing to admit. She stepped into the hallway, heels tapping softly on the tile, the echo disappearing as she turned the corner. Ethan remained still. He didn't usually watch people leave, but today, he found himself following the shape of her departure with a strange, steady attention, like watching a boat drift away from a dock, not knowing if it would return, but feeling certain it had changed the tide regardless. And for the first time in years, he wasn't entirely sure who was in control anymore. She didn't smile to please. She didn't flatter to stay. And yet, his office had never run smoother. From the moment Maggie Pierce stepped into the role, something subtle shifted in the atmosphere of Ethan Brooks's executive suite. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand pronouncements, no flashy presentations, no scent of ambition hanging in the air, just a calm, deliberate presence that moved through the room like wind through tall grass, unassuming, but undeniable. Ethan didn't notice it the first day. He was too caught up in quarterly figures and a board meeting that went longer than necessary. But by the third day, there was a rhythm to things he hadn't felt before. Meetings started on time, ended on time, files appeared where they needed to be, already annotated, color-coded, and trimmed of the usual clutter. Emails that once piled into a digital avalanche were sorted, summarized, and marked with only the ones requiring his input. It wasn't magic, it was Maggie. She didn't overstep. She simply realigned. Ethan, a man used to orchestrating every detail of his life, began to notice he was breathing easier. He hadn't realized how much of his mental energy had gone into compensating for inefficiencies until they were gone. He observed Maggie quietly in their morning briefings. She stood, never sat, holding a slim leather-bound notebook and a black pen that clicked only once. Her voice was steady, low, without the performative tone so many used when they spoke to him. There was no "good morning, sir," no nervous chatter, just, "Here's what's changed since yesterday. Here's what needs your review. Here's what can wait." Ethan found himself listening, really listening. That alone was a surprise. It wasn't just the logistics that changed. It was the energy. Ethan's staff, his assistant managers, department heads, even the facilities crew seemed less tense, less afraid of making a wrong move. One morning, his chief of finance, a typically reserved man in his late 50s, stopped by Ethan's office just to say, "I don't know who she is, but she's good. You don't even realize she's fixing things until they're already better." Ethan nodded, keeping his expression neutral. But inside, something warmed, not pride. Exactly Maggie's competence had little to do with him, but appreciation. She didn't just understand systems, she understood people. When a junior nurse left a file in the wrong inbox and panicked, Maggie didn't escalate it. She walked it over herself, smiled, and said, "We've all had mornings like this. Tomorrow will be better." The nurse nearly cried from relief. No one taught that kind of grace. The real turning point, however, came late on a Thursday afternoon. Ethan had just returned from a site inspection at one of their partner clinics, and he was tired, bone-deep tired. He dropped his briefcase on the side chair, loosened his collar, and opened the folder marked Confidential Legal. It was a proposed amendment to the Patient Privacy Agreement, dozens of pages long, dense, legalese on every line. He skimmed it quickly until something caught his eye. On page 14, nestled inside a paragraph about data sharing protocols, was a clause that allowed third-party pharmaceutical representatives limited access to non-identifying patient recovery data for research and partnership evaluation. It was vague, too vague, and potentially a public relations disaster if misinterpreted. Ethan's pulse quickened. How had legal let this slip? He reached for his phone, already dialing the chief legal officer, when he noticed a pale yellow post-it note stuck discreetly on the edge of the page. "Flag this clause. Suggesting rewording or removal feels legally sound but ethically unsteady. M.P." Ethan stared at the note for a long moment. She had caught it, quietly, without fanfare, no email, no dramatic warning, just awareness, thoughtfulness, a secretary. Yes, but also someone with a compass, finely tuned. He hung up the phone before the call could connect. Then, without thinking, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled long and slow. It was a small moment, but something inside him shifted. Trust, that was the word. He trusted her, not just to do her job, but to see things that mattered. The following Monday morning, he arrived at the office 10 minutes earlier than usual. The sun had only just begun to brush the tops of the palm trees outside the building. Inside, the corridors were quiet, the air still scented faintly with lemon polish and coffee. Maggie was already there. She sat at her desk, reading something on her screen, one hand loosely wrapped around a ceramic mug. Her hair was pinned back in its usual twist. No makeup, save for a touch of color on her lips. the same silver band on her right hand. She didn't look up right away, didn't jump to her feet, just glanced over when she sensed him and said, "Morning." He returned the greeting more gently than usual. She handed him the day's brief and walked alongside him to his office, noting 2 changes in the meeting order and reminding him that a patient family council member wanted 5 minutes before the noon board presentation. He paused at his desk, file in hand, watching her turn to leave. "Ms. Pierce," he said. She turned back. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded, no smile, but her eyes softened just slightly. "You're welcome." She closed the door behind her, leaving only quiet. And for the first time in years, Ethan realized he was no longer waking up for the work. He was waking up for the morning. She brought him tea with lavender and lemon, not because he asked, but because she noticed he coughed after coffee, the first time it happened. Ethan barely registered the gesture. He'd come in from a long board meeting, irritated by a poorly presented proposal and a sudden downpour that left his cuffs damp despite the umbrella. His usual mug of dark roast waited on his desk, steaming beside the morning reports. But beside it was another cup ceramic, pale blue, unfamiliar. A Post-it note was tucked neatly underneath. "You've cleared your throat 6 times after coffee this week. Just trying something gentler. M.P." He stared at it longer than he should have. The tea was floral, light, soothing in a way he hadn't realized he needed. The lemon wasn't sharp, just present. The lavender lingered on the back of his tongue like calm in liquid form. He didn't mention it, but the next morning, it was there again, and the next, and again. It became their unspoken ritual, not a replacement, not an order, just an offering, thoughtful, quiet. Maggie never asked if he liked it. She simply placed it where it needed to be, each morning, without fail. It wasn't the tea, really. It was the fact that she had noticed. Ethan had spent most of his professional life being observed for efficiency, performance, success. But this was different. This wasn't measurement. It was care, soft, unobtrusive, entirely unnecessary. And that was what made it matter. She noticed patterns, adjusted things before they became problems. She read between silences, knew when not to fill them. He began to feel something unfamiliar during their daily interactions, an ease that crept in like morning light under closed curtains. She never asked about his weekend, but she remembered the names of board members' spouses, the favorite coffee of the nurse administrator, and which pen Ethan preferred for signing donor letters. There was no flattery in it, just presence. He started to look forward to their 5-minute check-ins, not for the agenda, but for the space, the steadiness, the way she made the room feel less sharp. It was on a particularly gray Tuesday afternoon, one of those days where nothing was quite wrong, but nothing was right either, that Ethan found himself speaking without planning to. They were reviewing a donor's speech notes when he paused, tea cooling in his hand. "My father used to drink tea with lemon," he said, without looking up. Maggie didn't answer. She just listened. He was a school principal, quiet man, not much for talking, but when he did, you remembered it. He turned the mug slowly, watching the light catch on the rim. Never touched coffee. Said it made people too anxious. He kept a drawer of Twinings at home, lavender, lemon balm, chamomile. He glanced at her. She hadn't moved. He died the year I started medical school. Massive stroke. No warning. I wasn't there. Still. She said nothing, not because she didn't care, but because she knew this wasn't a story that needed commentary. It needed space. Ethan let out a slow breath. I spent years trying to outwork that grief. Thought if I became successful enough, dedicated enough, I'd earn the time I didn't get with him. He chuckled bitterly. Turns out, you can't buy back 24 hours, no matter how many lives you touch afterward. The silence between them was soft, gentle, not empty. Maggie finally spoke, her voice barely above the hum of the heating vent. Grief doesn't respond to logic, only to honesty. He looked up, surprised. She met his gaze evenly. And you just gave it some. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Not break, not ache, just shift. Like an old door opening in a house you hadn't walked through in years. The next day, he found himself standing in front of the hospital's small courtyard garden during lunch. He hadn't visited it in over a year. There was a bench near the fountain, shaded by a fig tree. He sat there, tea in hand, watching patients and staff move through their day. He didn't bring his phone. He didn't answer emails. He just sat. When he returned to his office, Maggie was at her desk, reading through a budget request. She didn't comment on his absence, didn't ask where he'd been. But when he stepped inside, the tea was already waiting for him. Still warm, still lavender and lemon, still exactly what he needed. That evening, after everyone had gone, he sat alone at his desk, files closed, lights low. The city beyond the windows was fading into dusky golds and grays. He thought of Maggie, of her calm, her steadiness, her silence. He thought of how rare it was to be seen without having to be impressive. And he realized he had told her more in one afternoon than he had told anyone in the past 5 years. Stranger still, he didn't regret it. He didn't feel exposed or vulnerable. He felt real. And for a man like Ethan Brooks, that was a rare, unfamiliar gift. One he wasn't sure how to thank her for. One he wasn't ready to let go of. He ran a hospital chain with military precision. But there was no time slot for her. It started with small hesitations. Not in Maggie, but in Ethan. For a man who prided himself on decision-making, on the speed and clarity of it, he began second-guessing himself in odd, quiet ways, lingering too long at her desk under the pretense of discussing a report, rereading emails she had already summarized, checking the break room for no reason, just to see if she happened to be in there. He told himself it was admiration, professional respect, a natural appreciation for competence. But then came the moments that couldn't be scheduled. A glimpse of her brushing hair from her face as she read, the subtle curve of her smile when she greeted the nurse team, the way her eyes softened when someone shared something difficult and didn't feel the need to hide it from her. Those things weren't bullet points in a briefing, they were hers. Ethan began to realize that the hours he looked forward to, most were the ones that weren't marked on his calendar. The 10 minutes before meetings when Maggie would quietly arrange his files and refill his tea, the soft knock on his door, signaling that she had anticipated something before he had to ask, the rare but steady moments when their eyes met across the room, and something unsaid passed between them, clear, gentle, unforced. It wasn't infatuation. That word belonged to younger men chasing dreams or illusions. This was something slower, more rooted. It was awareness of how easy it had become to talk to her, of how much lighter his days felt when she was near, of how deeply he trusted her not just with tasks, but with silence, and still. She kept her distance, respectfully, professionally, deliberately, never cold, never dismissive but firm in her boundaries, like a shoreline against the tide, unmoving even when it felt like something inside him was rising. He tried to ignore it. He scheduled more off-site meetings, extended his travel days, buried himself in compliance audits and system upgrades. But even in those efforts, she was there in the notes she prepared, the questions she anticipated, the calm her handwriting brought to his chaotic margins. And then, one evening, as dusk stretched long over the Santa Barbara hills, he found himself walking past her office. She hadn't left yet. Her desk lamp glowed softly against the warm tones of her sweater. She was organizing her files, her movements methodical, her expression focused but peaceful. He knocked gently on the frame. She looked up, not startled, just curious. "Dr. Brooks," she said. He stepped inside, holding 2 to-go cups. One was coffee, the other tea with lavender and lemon. "I was out grabbing something. Thought you might still be here." She accepted it with a small nod, her hands warm around the paper cup. "Thank you," she said simply. He stood there a moment longer, then without planning to sat in the chair across from her. She raised an eyebrow. Just slightly. "I wanted to ask something," he said. She waited. "It's been some time since I've had dinner with someone who wasn't on my payroll or trying to pitch a merger." A pause. "I thought maybe, if you're free one evening, you might join me." Her hand stayed around the cup. She didn't blink, didn't pull away. But the stillness that settled between them wasn't the easy silence they usually shared. It was heavier, cautious. Ethan felt the air thicken around him. He didn't withdraw the offer, but he didn't press it either. Finally, Maggie spoke. "I can't." The words were soft, not harsh, and they didn't carry finality, just clarity. He nodded once, unsure of what to say. She placed the cup gently on the table. "It's not that I don't respect you," she said, "or appreciate what we've built here, but this space, we've made it steady, safe, clear." She took a breath, steady and sure. "I've spent years rebuilding myself, piece by piece. I know the line between connection and complication. I can't afford to blur it again. Not here, not like this." Ethan looked at her, not as a man disappointed, but as a man who suddenly understood. There was more kindness in her refusal than in many people's acceptance. And strangely, he didn't feel wounded. He felt seen. Later that night, alone in his condo, Ethan stood by the window watching the city wind down. The lights flickered across the horizon like soft beacons, some near, some distant, all living lives he would never know. He thought about Maggie's words, about boundaries drawn not from fear, but from strength. He had asked her to dinner. She had answered with truth, not rejection, just self-respect. And it struck him how rare it was, in his world of leverage and negotiation, to hear an honest no without resentment or pretense. It made him admire her more, not less. The next morning, she was there at her desk, as always, calm, composed. He greeted her with the same quiet warmth as every other day, and she returned it not with awkwardness or avoidance, but with the same steady presence that had first made him feel safe enough to speak. The tea was on his desk by 8:01. Lavender, lemon, exactly what he needed. It wasn't just a letter. It was a goodbye from the only person who had made him feel like a man, not a machine. Ethan saw it the moment he walked into his office, centered, straight, quietly waiting. A cream-colored envelope with his name written in clean, looping cursive. No company header, no memo code, just his name. He stared at it for a long moment, heart picking up its pace in a way no investor call or media inquiry ever had. He didn't have to open it to know what it meant. His steps slowed as he crossed the room. The air felt heavier, as if the walls had thickened overnight. He sat down, picked up the envelope, ran a thumb over the seal, and then opened it. "Dear Dr. Brooks, this has been one of the most meaningful positions I've held in my professional life. Working here, with you, has reminded me of my own strength and value, not because of any title, but because I stayed true to myself, which is why I know it's time to leave. The boundary I once drew has become a quiet ache I carry with me. It's no longer just a professional space, it's personal, and I cannot pretend otherwise without compromising who I am. Please don't think this is resignation born of weakness or avoidance. It is, in fact, the hardest decision I've made since losing my husband, but I leave with gratitude for the order we built, for the trust you gave, for the human moments I didn't think I'd ever share again. My last day will be Friday. I will ensure a full transition file is prepared for whoever comes next. Wishing you continued clarity, purpose, and peace. With respect, Margaret Pierce." The paper trembled slightly in his hands. Though the office was still, for a moment, he did nothing. No reaction, no reaching for his phone, no calling Marla or legal or HR, just silence. The kind that comes after impact, the kind that fills the space where a presence used to be. He had thought the moment would come with warning, some signal, a missed step, a strained glance, but Maggie had kept her grace until the last minute. Even in goodbye, she was composed, not dramatic, Not cruel, just resolute. And yet, something in Ethan fractured, not visibly. He didn't break things, didn't raise his voice. That wasn't his way. But inside, a quiet collapse. Because what do you do when the person who never needed you becomes the one you need most? He didn't know. The rest of the day unfolded with painful normalcy. Meetings, calls, reviews. Maggie came and went, delivering notes, forwarding emails, confirming calendar adjustments precisely as she always had. No faltering, no avoidance, but also no lingering glances, no morning tea, no small acknowledgments. She had already begun her departure, not by walking out, but by gently removing herself from the spaces where their connection used to live. Ethan noticed it all, and he felt it, every inch of it. That evening, after the last meeting, he stayed at his desk while the office dimmed around him. He could hear the custodial staff further down the hall, the soft click of vacuum wheels against tile. Maggie knocked once before entering. She held a small folder transition documents, clearly labeled, organized. "I'll have the digital backup sent by tomorrow," she said. He nodded. His throat was too tight for words. She placed the folder on the table between them, her hands steady. "Thank you," she added, "not just for the job, but for something more." He looked up at her, finally meeting her eyes. They weren't cold. They never were. But they were decided. "I'm sorry," he said at last. Maggie's expression softened, just enough. "You don't have to be," she replied gently. "Some things are beautiful, even when they're unfinished." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to him in years. She turned to leave, pausing briefly at the door. "I left your tea," she added. One last time, then she walked out quietly, gracefully, like always, and Ethan didn't follow. Couldn't. His feet stayed rooted, his hands still resting on the desk, his heart suddenly heavier than the years he'd spent trying to protect it. Minutes passed, maybe more. The room felt larger without her in it, and colder, though the thermostat remained unchanged. He glanced toward the corner of the desk. The cup was there, ceramic, pale blue, lavender and lemon, still warm. He picked it up, but didn't drink it. Instead, he closed his eyes and let the scent wash over him. He thought of every small moment, every word unsaid, every boundary honored, and for the first time since Maggie had entered his life, he had no idea what to do next. Not because he lacked direction, but because the map he'd followed no longer fit the terrain of his heart. He had money, power, and buildings with his name on them. But that night, the silence in his condo was deafening. Ethan stood in the entryway, key still in hand, coat draped over his arm. The lights were off, save for the soft amber glow of the hallway sconce. The condo was immaculate, just as he left it, quiet, expensive, lifeless. He didn't move for a while. The place had once felt like a sanctuary. Now, it felt like a museum curated by someone who'd forgotten how to live. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and noticed something odd. His teacup from the morning was still in his briefcase, lavender and lemon, the last one. He carried it into the kitchen and set it on the counter. He didn't pour it out. He couldn't. That evening unfolded in long silences and restless pacing. The fridge was full, but he wasn't hungry. The TV flickered with muted news, but he wasn't listening. The city lights blinked outside his windows, but they didn't hold his gaze. Instead, he wandered from room to room like a stranger in someone else's life. In the study, he ran his fingers along the edge of his bookshelf and noticed the layer of dust he'd never cared about before. In the bedroom, he pulled open a drawer and stared at a row of cufflinks, each one chosen for meetings, not meaning. It all felt so curated, so sterile, so empty. Eventually, he stepped outside. No destination, no plan, just the rhythm of his footsteps on the sidewalk, the cool night air brushing against his collar. He walked past coffee shops just closing up, their chairs stacked neatly and windows fogged from a day's warmth. He passed a young couple leaning into each other on a park bench, whispering something only the moon could hear. He saw an older man walking a slow, shaggy dog, humming under his breath. No one recognized him. No one called him doctor or sir. And for once, he was grateful. He sat down on a bench near the fountain in the city park, an old, weathered thing he barely noticed during the day. Now, it looked gentle, timeless, almost kind. He leaned back and let the silence surround him. It was a different kind of quiet than the one in his office, or his home. This silence wasn't empty. It was full of other lives, real lives, people who fought and laughed and cried and loved without quarterly reports or press releases. People who didn't need a boardroom to feel important. And somewhere in that silence, Maggie's absence pressed against his chest like a weight. Not because he had lost a brilliant assistant, but because he had let go of the one person who made him feel like he wasn't just functioning, he was feeling. He thought back to the tea, the notes, the silence she held when he needed it most, the soft strength of her refusal, the dignity in her goodbye, and then, without intending to, he imagined something he had never dared to before, a life where she wasn't across the hall, managing his calendar, but beside him, sharing a day, sharing dinner, sharing silence not because they had to, but because it was enough, not as an employee, as something more. That thought stopped him. It scared him, because it meant letting go of control, of roles, of boundaries. It meant becoming human again. And for Ethan, that was the bravest proposal he could ever make. He stood, walked back through the quiet streets, his pace more certain now. When he reached home, he didn't sit down. He didn't make a drink or check his email. He walked straight to his study, opened his contact book, and dialed a number he hadn't used in over 6 months. It rang twice before a low voice answered. "Ethan," said the chairman of the board, surprised. "Everything all right?" Ethan looked out the window, watching the city blink. "No," he said simply, "but I think it could be." A pause. "I want to talk about restructuring my role, about stepping back." Another pause. Then a dry laugh from the other end. "Retirement?" "Not yet," Ethan replied, "but a realignment." And what brought this on Ethan's eyes softened? A letter. He hung up soon after, promising a formal proposal by the week's end. Then, for the first time in months, he turned off every light in the condo, lay down on the couch, and let the dark hold him, not like an absence, but like a blanket. Somewhere. A woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a quiet strength was folding her last office blouse into a suitcase. And Ethan Brooks, the man who had everything, was finally starting to feel something worth keeping. He didn't want her under him. He wanted her beside him. Ethan had walked into hundreds of boardrooms in his life. He had defended 7-figure proposals, negotiated hospital acquisitions, debated policy reforms with some of the sharpest minds in medicine and finance, but never had he entered a room with a heart that beat quite like this. Not out of fear, but out of care. And that was a new feeling. He stood at the head of the long mahogany table, the central haven board seated in a half circle of polished confidence. Familiar faces, some wary, some waiting, some watching to see what kind of Ethan Brooks would show up today. Not the strategist, not the surgeon, the man. He clicked the remote once. The title slide came up, Proposal Director of Patient Advocacy, no fanfare, no corporate jargon, just the truth of what he was asking. He let the silence hold for a breath before speaking. "I've come to ask for the creation of a new leadership role, one that doesn't fit our usual charts or ladders. A role rooted not in efficiency or profit, but in empathy." A rustle at the far end of the table. Someone leaned forward. Ethan continued. "This position would report independently outside my office, outside finance, outside compliance. Their job would be to represent the patient voice at the highest level. Not in theory, not in a token survey, but in real decisions." The first slide faded into a bullet point list. Job scope, objectives, ethics oversight, patient liaison, internal culture bridge. He spoke clearly, each word trimmed of excess, but behind every line, he thought of her, of the way she noticed a nurse's tired eyes before the nurse even spoke, of how she remembered birthdays no one else did, of how she had made the air in his office feel breathable again. One of the board members, a retired oncologist, asked the inevitable question. Why now? Ethan looked him in the eye. Because healing is not just about medicine. It's about being seen, heard, dignified. We have systems, we have structures, but we lack someone who walks through the cracks, who sees not just outcomes, but people. He took a breath. I know someone who already does this, without a title, who has earned the trust of both patients and staff, who never asked to lead, but people follow her anyway. And what's her name? Another board member asked. Ethan paused, then answered, simply, Margaret Pierce. The room quieted, some nodded, a few murmured in recognition. She's not a nurse, nor a doctor, he continued, but she understands both languages, and she carries neither bias nor agenda, just care. The kind we talk about in our mission statements, but rarely appoint a seat at the table for. There was something raw in his voice, not rehearsed, not polished. Real. It hung in the room, more compelling than any graph he could have shown. The board deliberated briefly. The legal counsel asked a few clarifying questions. HR proposed structuring it as a hybrid advisory director role. Ethan agreed. In the end, they voted, unanimously. The position was approved, and with it, a space purposefully carved for a different kind of leadership, not based on rank, but on presence. That evening, the sun had begun to dip into the Pacific, casting a quiet warmth through Ethan's condo windows. He stood by the desk, phone in hand, heart louder than he wanted to admit. He hesitated, not out of doubt, but respect. Then he called. The line rang once, twice. Hello? Her voice, clear, steady. It had only been a few days, but it felt like a season had passed. Hi, Maggie, he said. It's Ethan. A pause. Not awkward, just careful. I hope this isn't too late, he added. It's fine, she replied. What's going on? He explained, not rushed, but direct. The new role, the structure, the intention. He told her what it wasn't a promotion, a favor, a way to hold on to her, and what it was a role designed with her values in mind, independent, respected, necessary. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she said nothing for a long moment. He waited, let the silence breathe. Finally, she asked the question he expected and hoped for. Why me? He let out a soft breath. Because when you walked into my office, things got quieter, not just around me, but inside me. And because when you said no, it wasn't defiance, it was clarity. I trust you, Maggie, not just to advocate, but to guide. Another pause. You don't owe me an answer, he added. She gave a gentle exhale. No, but I do owe myself one. Then, quietly, I'll meet you. To talk. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if grounding himself. Anywhere you'd like, he said. A small pause, then, the garden by the rehab wing. Friday, 4 p.m. He smiled, not wide, just real. I'll be there. After they hung up, Ethan sat by the window with his tea. Yes, still lavender and lemon, and looked out over the city he had helped shape. But tonight, his mind wasn't on buildings or systems or titles. It was on a bench, under the jacaranda tree, where maybe the woman who once said no might be ready to say something else. They met where no one wore a tie, where no one was called sir. The garden behind the rehab wing was quiet that afternoon. Late summer light filtered through clusters of wisteria, their violet petals swaying in the breeze like small, thoughtful dancers. A nurse passed slowly in the distance, pushing an elderly woman in a wheelchair. The fountain murmured softly. Ethan arrived early. He always did. But today, he wasn't checking his watch. He wasn't revising mental talking points. He simply sat on the wooden bench beneath the wisteria and breathed. It smelled faintly of lavender. He didn't bring a folder, no papers, no phone, just himself. By the time Maggie walked into the garden, the shadows had lengthened slightly. She wore a navy blouse, simple earrings, her hair pulled back. She looked like herself, not a version of herself for an office, just Maggie. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. She walked over and sat beside him, not too close, not too far, just enough. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was present. A kind of stillness Ethan had come to associate only with her, the rare kind that didn't demand to be filled. Birdsong filtered in from the hedge. Somewhere, a gardener turned off a hose. Finally, Maggie spoke first. "It's quieter than I remember." Ethan smiled faintly. "I've been coming here more often lately." She nodded once. "It suits you." They fell into another pause, but this time it felt like a beginning, not a gap. "I read the full role description," Maggie said, not looking at him. "It's thoughtful." "I had help," he said gently. She glanced at him. "From who?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "From all the moments I didn't handle well." That made her smile just a little. He looked down at his hands, resting on his knees. "It's strange, isn't it? You spend your life building things, systems, outcomes, but sometimes the most meaningful change comes from something small, like a cup of tea," she said. He chuckled softly. "Exactly." Another pause. Then Ethan asked, more quietly this time, "Have you thought about it?" Maggie nodded. "I have." He didn't push, she went on. "It's a beautiful idea, Ethan, and it's needed. Deeply. I could see myself doing it. Not for you, but for the patients. For the ones who never get to speak in the rooms where decisions are made." He looked at her then, carefully. "That's why I wanted you, because you do it for them, not for me." Maggie turned slightly toward him. Her expression was unreadable, but open. "Why did you really call me back?" she asked, not accusingly, just softly. Ethan let the question sit for a moment. Then, without drama, he answered, "Because I missed being seen." That made her breath catch just slightly. He added, "I spent years being listened to, followed, even admired, but rarely understood. You did that without asking for anything in return." She said nothing, and he didn't go further, didn't offer declarations, didn't cross lines, because some truths don't need escalation, just space, and she gave it. The wisteria swayed gently above them. A petal fell onto Maggie's shoulder. She brushed it off absently, then looked out across the lawn. "You know," she said, "after my husband died, I thought I had used up my lifetime allotment of emotional capacity. I told myself I'd spend the rest of my years being useful, but never soft." Ethan turned toward her. "I think you're both." She looked at him. Now really looked. "That's what frightened me," she said. Not angry, not regretful, just honest. And now he asked. Maggie exhaled, the kind of breath that held more than air. "Now." "I'm learning that softness isn't weakness, but it does need the right space." They fell quiet again. No rush, no pressure, just presence. And in that quiet, a bird landed briefly on the edge of the fountain, dipped its beak, and flew off. Ethan shifted slightly, his fingers brushing the wood of the bench. "I don't want you to come back into my office," he said. She tilted her head. "I want you to come back into the work," he clarified, "but not into my space, just beside it." Maggie smiled, not wide, but sure, I could consider that. They sat a while longer. Sunlight dappled the path. A child's laughter echoed faintly from the other wing. The air held that rare balance between warmth and wind. Then, slowly, gently, Maggie reached over. Her hand rested on his, not as possession, not as invitation, just as contact, and she let it stay. Ethan didn't speak, didn't move, but something in him quieted, fully, Finally. Not everything had to be solved. Not everything needed a name. Some things simply were. And that afternoon, under the wisteria, two people who had once met across a desk sat side by side with nothing between them but the space they had both earned. She never asked him to change, but he did because for the first time, he wanted to. 6 months had passed, enough for seasons to shift, enough for hearts to settle into new rhythms. At Central Haven Hospital, subtle changes had taken root, not in grand announcements or marketing campaigns, but in the quiet corners where people talked about the things that truly mattered. The position of Director of Patient Advocacy was no longer a novel. It had a name, a rhythm, a presence: Maggie Pierce. Her office was modest, tucked between the staff wellness lounge and a side hallway that led to pediatrics. But everyone found their way there: nurses, interns, even patients' families who'd never met her before but had heard, somehow, that she listens. And she did. With full attention, with both warmth and boundaries, with that rare ability to make people feel safe without needing to be saved, Ethan watched from a respectful distance. He no longer hovered, no longer popped in under false pretenses to ask about a memo. He had learned to let Maggie lead in her own way. That was the biggest change of all, not in her, in him. Ethan Brooks, the man who once ran entire hospital networks on 5 hours of sleep and relentless control, had begun doing something radical. He left the office by 6:00 p.m., not always, but often enough that people noticed. He started walking home when the weather allowed. He cooked nothing fancy, but enough to remind himself what butter in a pan sounded like. He called his sister back more often, sent birthday cards, sat longer with colleagues instead of rushing off to the next thing. He still wore suits, still made sharp decisions, still knew the weight of his name, but something in his gaze had softened. It was as if he had finally stepped out of the role he had played for decades and was learning, slowly, how to be Ethan. Not the title, just the man. They never announced anything, no office whispers, no grand declarations. But people noticed. How his expression lifted just slightly when Maggie passed by in the hallway. How he lingered at the hospital garden bench after meetings once a week, never scheduled. How Maggie sometimes brought a second cup of tea to her office. And how it was never wasted. On the administrative floor, Marla from HR told her new assistant, "I don't think they're dating. I think they're becoming." The assistant didn't understand what she meant, but one day she would. Because love, when it's real, doesn't always declare itself. Sometimes it just arrives and stays. Maggie never asked Ethan to slow down. She never demanded that he soften or shift. She only insisted on being herself, and somehow, that gave him permission to meet her there, not in control, not in command, but in presence. He began showing up to department roundtables he used to skip, not to speak, but to listen. When a young nurse broke down about burnout, Ethan stayed after the meeting and asked one simple question. "What do you need that we're not giving you?" It wasn't a PR moment. There were no cameras, just a man learning to hear what had been there all along. Even his relationship with silence changed. It used to be something he filled with decisions, with movement, with achievement. Now, it was something he kept. He began leaving space at the end of conversations. Moments for breath, for thought, for truth to emerge unforced. He realized that Maggie had done that all along, and it had taken him years to see it for what it was. Not hesitation, wisdom. One Friday afternoon, Maggie found a note on her desk. Not an email, a real note, on thick paper, handwritten in neat, deliberate strokes. Garden, 6:15. If the bench is free, E. She smiled, folded it gently, and went. They didn't talk about work, or the past, or the future. They sat. Sometimes they watched the fountain. Sometimes they watched each other. Once, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't move, but his eyes closed, very slowly. That was all. On a Sunday morning in early spring, The light poured through the kitchen windows of Ethan's home, soft and golden. He was barefoot, wearing an old college sweatshirt. Maggie was curled in the corner of the porch swing, her teacup between her palms, her legs tucked beneath her. They had no plans that day, no agenda. A gentle breeze carried in the scent of rosemary from the planter boxes outside. The birds were busy in the hedges. Somewhere, a neighbor's wind chime sang a lazy lullaby. Ethan stepped onto the porch with his own cup and sat beside her. No words. They didn't need them. The silence between them had grown into something warm, not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything else. Trust, peace, companionship. The kind of love that doesn't need to be named to be known. He looked out toward the garden, remembering everything it had taken to get here. The walls he had built, the walls she had honored, the ones they had, gently, allowed to fall. He thought about what he had learned, not just about her or about the hospital, but about himself. He used to think leadership was about never being questioned. Now he understood it was about knowing when to be quiet. He used to think control was strength. Now he knew that real strength was choosing connection over certainty. He glanced over at her. She was looking at the sky, relaxed, peaceful. Her hand rested on his thigh, not possessive, not performative, just steady. He placed his own hand over hers. And that was enough. They didn't speak about the future. They didn't need to. Because love, at this stage in life, isn't about grand beginnings or urgent declarations. It's about presence, about choosing to stay, every quiet, ordinary day. And in that still moment, Ethan Brooks, the man who once ruled with certainty, finally learned to live with something far richer: acceptance. We spend so much of life trying to hold things together: careers, responsibilities, appearances. We strive to be respected, needed, even admired. But somewhere along the way, we can forget the quiet truth: being understood is far more healing than being impressive. Ethan built a world of success, but it wasn't until he met Maggie, someone who neither chased him nor feared him, that he learned the real power of listening, not just to others, but to his own long-ignored heart. The greatest changes often begin not with grand gestures, but with someone showing up as their whole, honest self. Maggie didn't try to fix Ethan. She simply refused to disappear in the shadow of his power, and that helped him finally step into the light of his own humanity. This story reminds us that love isn't about control or rescue. It's about presence. And sometimes, the most profound healing comes when we allow someone to walk beside us, not behind us. So, today, ask yourself, are you controlling life or are you living it? Sometimes, the softest voices carry the deepest truths. Thank you for spending your precious time with us. If this story touched your heart, helped you feel seen, or simply gave you a quiet moment of reflection, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs it, and subscribing to our channel for more stories that speak to the soul. Your support helps us keep telling the kinds of stories that matter. Until next time, take care and keep listening to life's quiet truths.